Hi and welcome. This is Police Stories Podcast. This is episode 46. This is a series of short stories about my 28-year career in the UK police force. So good downloads again. Thanks very much. Hope you enjoyed listening. If this is your first time, welcome. So this week we've talked about a few incidents that I'd had in South London whilst on uniform patrol. If you remember back a few episodes, the reason that I transferred from my original force to come to the Met was I was looking for a promotion. I was working on the basis that, the Met has, I think at the time it was 35,000 cops, whereas the force I was coming from was 3,000, quite a small force. And therefore, to my thinking, there was a lot more sergeant opportunities in the Met. And there was other reasons as well, which I talked about in that previous episode, but that was the thinking ultimately. So I'd taken and passed my, what's called my Osprey Part 1 exam, which was the sergeant's exam to test your sort of knowledge of the law and general sort of sergeanty type procedure. So I was promotable at that point. The systems have changed over the years, but at the time you basically did this exam, which was pretty horrendous, quite lengthy and covered an awful lot. Managed to pass that on my second attempt, and then you were then promotable. And what normally happened is you were invited to act up, not play the fool, although I regularly did, but more become an acting sergeant or a temporary sergeant. Certainly I think it was an acting sergeant was what they called it there at the time. And normally, when there was a sergeant sort of slot open on one of the teams, you would be invited to act up, and that would be you as effectively a sergeant for a period of time, and that was chosen. It wasn't really set at the beginning. They might say, well, we'll give you 6 months, 3 months, maybe a year even, depending on how it went. Now, in some respects, you always felt like, you were kind of special if you'd been invited. But the reality is, the Met is a great big machine with a lot of working parts. And as other sergeants move on to either promoted, retired, whatever, onto specialist units, they needed to backfill those sergeants. So quite often it was purely a need. It was like, well, he's got a bit of service, and he's passed the exam, so he probably wants to be a sergeant one day. Why don't we ask him? So it didn't mean you were particularly special. It more meant that basically there was a gap and they needed to fill it. So anyway, I was asked to act up. Now the only slight issue was I was asked to become an acting sergeant on the team I already worked on. So that's a double-edged sword. Firstly, it can be quite awkward because one day you're sitting in the car, with your other colleagues driving round, probably moaning about, the ogre of a sergeant you've got and how he or she makes you do all these unpleasant things and you get more work than everyone else. And then the following day, that's you sat with the stripes in the sergeant's chair, dishing out the jobs, trying not to do the things that you'd always moaned about, as a sergeant. The other thing was that, these were your friends and you'd known them as a PC, so it can be quite difficult to then have to, have stern words, discipline, or even give, rubbish tasks to, to people that were your friends ultimately, or at least they were the day before you became a sergeant. Hopefully they still continue to be. And, the more mature ones got that your role had changed and that suddenly you did have to kind of put your foot down occasionally and tell people what to do, even though it was unpleasant. For me, I always felt that the secret was, firstly, they knew where I came from, so that they knew that I was equally willing, to do the unpleasant tasks that I'd given them. And in fact, they knew that I'd carried it out, lots of times myself anyway. So it wasn't like I was sort of special. And that, of course, is the issue with sometimes the accelerated promotion scheme that some forces offer, or the direct entry. That's even worse, in my opinion, where some people with degrees or whatever can go straight in at kind of, inspector level or chief inspector level or quite often superintendent level. Now, I haven't got quite such an issue of it as superintendent level, because at that level, that's quite a high rank. You're not really, a cop anymore, not in the modern day police anyway. You're very much a manager, you're managing resources, you get a budget, you're moving sort of, chess pieces around the board. So you're very much more a manager. So actually I see that if you've got a degree and perhaps you've come from a managerial background, you could probably slot into that role. But when you start talking about direct entry, inspectors, for example, most people would expect an inspector to have, you know, been a PC, to been a sergeant, to come through the ranks, to be in the trenches and do all those unpleasant tasks. And when they were asking you to go and stand on a crime scene for hours in the dark and the cold and the rain, the reality is you knew that he or she had also done that many times themselves. You know, it was just a sort of rite of passage. And I always felt, one of the things I certainly always made sure of it, I might have dished out at early morning briefing or early morning prayers, you know, where you give out the jobs for the day. You know, in a busy place like South London, I might have had 5 or 6 different crime scenes that I had to put at least one, if not a pair of cops to each crime scene, or locus as they call it in Scotland, to cover that, to guard it, to protect it for forensics to go in and to make sure that it was kept. You know, certainly there was some continuity. They would start a scene log. They would keep a record, a written record of who went in and out of that scene. And that was partially so we could protect it and limit how many people went in that scene, so we didn't ruin any forensics. And it was also partially so that if we found DNA in that scene, fingerprints, a boot mark or something, we knew who'd been in and out. So we were able to go to them and potentially get DNA off them. In fact, a lot of cops had actually already voluntarily given their DNA so that they could very quickly be ruled out of crime scenes. Now, when I ask people to do that, particularly in the winter, and, you know, the sensible cop always looks to be able to do it from his vehicle maybe, or from within a doorway, or, you know, a protected position. But you can imagine if there's been, you know, a nasty assault or something in a park, you know, in the middle of a field, there's every chance you might have, you know, 100 square yards that you've got to protect and put police tape up and stop people going into. There's nowhere to hide. You know, it might be pouring a rain, it might be blowing a hoolie, it might be snowing, you know, but unfortunately there is literally no shelter that can be sought. I'd like to think that I was a reasonable acting sergeant, and in that scenario I always made the effort to take my guys and girls, you know, a hot drink. I would go and cover it for half an hour and say, look, my car's over there, the heater's on, go and sit in there and warm up, you'll find a coffee in there for you. I just thought that went a long way, and I know that when I was in their position, that's exactly what I would have wanted. So I did that a lot, you know, and I think, you know, it went a long way. Anyway, I'm digressing and waffling as I regularly do, but that was the sort of thing. So it's a big change in some respects. You start off being effectively a sergeant. Like I say, you are the one dishing out the orders. But of course, don't forget, you've also got the inspector above you who will be tasking you with things. I need somebody to do this. I need somebody to do that. So you're the one who's deciding where those resources go. But certainly, as it was in South London, what would quite often happen is it would be me and either another very much senior sergeant, you know, perhaps been doing it for years, or probably the inspector, just in a car. And we would be driving round the borough sort of firefighting. And the idea was that should, you know, let's say an attempt murder comes in, a robbery or whatever, cops are obviously going there, PCs are going there, they're going to get there first and they're going to start that initial investigation. And the experienced ones on the RT car, the area car, for example, would know what needed to be done to start with. But as a supervisor, as a sergeant, and then maybe with your inspector, you would just be going around doing this firefighting role, checking in at the scene. Everything okay? Have you got the tape up? Have you started the log? You know, have you called forensics? Have you done this? Has anyone been tasked with doing house to house? So you'd just be going on. Now, virtually always, you'd go along, and if they're an experienced cop, they'd be like, yeah, I've done this. I've asked him to do that. I've spoken to scenes of crime. They're on their way. We've got the tape up. You know, so-and-so started the house-to-house inquiries. I've managed to speak to that shop over there, and they're taking out their CCTV recording to make sure it doesn't get recorded over, you know. So they started all those things. If it was a sudden death, for example, again, generally a supervisor would always go and just kind of dot the I's and cross the T's, make sure that, have you had a search round? Is there anything of value in the house, particularly because quite often you find a lot of cash in houses, especially with older people. They didn't believe in banks, so they'd stuff it in, you know, coffee jars and things. That's the sort of thing you wanted to take away from the scene, because if the house got burgled, you know, when some of the local sort of tow rags knew that, you know, the old person who lived there had died, they might be straight in that address thinking they're looking for valuables, whether it was jewellery or whatever. So again, you would just go there and make sure, have we looked around the house? Have we found the medication? Have we double checked that there's no kind of suicide note left or anything like that? And again, experienced cops knew the score with this, but the younger ones, you obviously had to steer in the right direction. But it was a really good role. I thoroughly enjoyed it because you didn't get bogged down in any one job. You very much, you know, sort of floated around the borough, from job to job, checking on people and checking on things and making sure things were happening. You'd be liaising with other departments, whether it's CID or the robbery squad or the gang unit or whatever, and telling them, we've got a bit of an issue here, a couple of the guys have got someone stopped, could you send some of your guys down? You know, it was really, for me, a really enjoyable role. However, one of the most unpleasant tasks I ever had, I'd only been an acting sergeant for probably like a month or something, and the reality is, you know, you go off duty one day, you get told you're going to be a sergeant, you come back in the next day and somebody throws you some sergeant stripes on epaulets, you know, and you put them on, and that's you, a sergeant, you know, and of course everyone knew that you'd had no training at that point, you'd had no extra skills, it was just the same old person, but now you're wearing stripes. So sometimes it got people's backs up a bit, you know, and that was where it was maybe difficult, you know, if it was people you knew. Anyway, on this particular shift, I came in on an early turn. So generally what would happen, you know, you'd come in for, it was maybe a 7 o'clock start in the morning. So, you know, you'd be in perhaps 6:30, 6:45. You'd speak to the off-going shift, the inspectors and the sergeant, say what happened overnight, get a bit of a feel for, you know, where you were going to have to direct your resources for that day, which is exactly what I did. But as soon as I came in, the night turn inspector called me into the office and said, right, I've got a fairly difficult task for you. And I was like, okay. And they said the locker room in the NIC, so the locker room where everyone, you know, comes in at the beginning of the shift, but more importantly, goes to at the end of their shift, where they collect their, you know, civilian jackets and they get their car keys and they put away their body armour and their uniform, and all the safes are in there where all the sort of CS or pepper spray is kept in individual safes, and the radios go into the charging points, and body-worn cameras, if you've got it, are kept in there. You know, you imagine what a locker room is. But people have to go via there to go off duty because they need to collect those things and also drop off all their other bits and pieces. So it's absolutely vital for you going home. Now, bearing in mind, these guys and girls have done, you know, maybe a 12-hour plus night shift, and they're hanging out. You know, they are really tired and they just want to go home to their beds. They're particularly grumpy at this point, where the inspector said, right, difficult role for you. I need you to go to the locker room and put a crime scene on it and start a log. And I was kind of incredulous. I was like, what are you talking about? You know, this is in the NIC. Don't tell me something's happened in the locker room, I naively said. You know, and he said to me, that's exactly what's happened. There's something in there. I need you to put police tape up, start a crime scene log and secure it. Nobody in, nobody out. If anyone's got a problem, they come and see me. Well, I knew everyone would have a problem because obviously, like I said, people basically can't go home. All their car keys are in the locker. You know, all their civilian jackets are in there. They need to put all their stuff away. So can you imagine how unpopular I was? Of course, initially people thought it was a joke. You know, I went up, put my police tape up, stood there, started a log and put down, you know, kind of who was going in or out, which at that point I'd been instructed was nobody. So initially I got a few of the young cops, the probation, sort of coming back going, all right, mind out of the way, you know, we've just been released, so we can go home. You know, I can't wait to get to my bed. You know, I'm so tired. You know, what a night we had. I've been on 16 hours because I'm still on from the late turn, the back shift yesterday. You know, I started yesterday afternoon. And you're going, you're not going to believe this, and I'm really sorry, but you can't go in the locker room. Of course, they were like, what? Of course I can. You know, I need to get my keys. I need to get home. And you're like, no, I'm not joking. You know, this is a crime scene. You can't come in. So I took a lot of abuse, I can tell you. You know, people were, say, grumpy at the best of times, but they were tired as well. They needed to go home, and they couldn't, and I was stopping them, you know. So I was the devil as far as they were concerned. And, yeah, I got a fair bit of stick, to say the least. And when the more senior cops came, you know, the sort of area car drivers, the guys and girls of 10 and 15 years in that were basically the same as me, but I had these temporary stripes on, they didn't pull their punches. You know, I got a mouthful off of at least 2 or 3 of them and I had to say, look, guys, I totally hear you. I exactly understand, and I would be exactly the same. If you've got a problem, and of course you've got a problem, which I understand, go and see the inspector and he will sort you out. You know, he'll square you away because I can't change it. And the problem was as well, even if I had known, I probably couldn't have told them. But at that point, I didn't know what would happen either. So it was only later on I actually found out what had happened, you know. And what they did after a couple of hours, there was no way I'm going to be a riot at the locker room, you know, and I was probably going to be seriously assaulted by my colleagues. They actually started escorting, the inspector would escort people individually in to go to their lockers to get you know, like their car keys and put their stuff away, and they managed to do that. But we had to, you know, log it all and register it all. And in fact, by then, what was believed to be in the locker room had already been recovered. And it was only later on that I found out the true story. So I'll tell you the story. It's fairly uncomfortable listening from my point of view as a cop. But basically, there'd been an experienced cop out with a brand new probationer, and they had been driving around at night. They, for whatever reason, coppers knows, or call it what you will, they hadn't liked the look of, it probably come from the senior cop, he hadn't liked the look of a particular car, so they stopped it at 3 o'clock in the morning. Classic, stop this car, we'll have a word with the driver and see what we think. So they stopped the car, had a word with the driver, they could smell drink on him straight away, alcohol, so they had him out and breath tested him. He failed the breath test, so he got arrested. So while they were there, they had another quick poke around the car. You've got a search power now for that car, now the person's been arrested. For various reasons, you may have already had one, but you've definitely got one once the person's been arrested under PACE, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. So they had a little poke around, and they found some cocaine in some bags. So they had a bit more of an in-depth search while they were waiting for the van to come and transport this prisoner. And sure enough, they turned up, you know, half a dozen bags of cocaine, small ones, but still, you know, a nice little stop. And actually, in any other time, this would have been a nice little job. Because they got, you know, a bit of cocaine back, they got a drink driver in, and actually a really nice little self-generated job, which is the sort of thing that every cop, you know, would be trying to do of a night shift, especially in your downtime, if, dare I say it, you had any. The problem was the inspector quite rightly instructed them, right, we've got this guy in custody, he's got some cocaine and he's got enough to suggest that he might be dealing as well, so we need to go and search his home address. And this is where the problem started. So they didn't need a warrant because it was signed off by the inspector. Again, under this PACE Act, you know, there's certain criteria needs to be met, and then the inspector can authorise a search back at a home address without a warrant. And of course, the classic is when you turn up at the address, everyone always goes, "Where's your warrant?" You know, but people have no clue about the law, and don't realise, you know, that in a lot of cases you don't actually need one, as was the case at this point. So up until this point, no problems. They go into the address, so you've got the experienced cop and the probationer. They search the address, and they turn up quite a bit more cocaine. I mean, I don't think we're talking like kilos, but maybe, you know, 20 more bags. They also find some car keys of a vehicle, and when they stand outside, they didn't know what the vehicle was, but they pressed, you know, the pipper to unlock a car, and a nearby car kind of bleeped at them and unlocked itself. So they went and had a look at this car. They found some more cocaine and a load of cash in that car, and when they checked the car and on its plates, it was actually a stolen car as well. So this was turning into a really nice little job. So up until this point, fantastic. The problem was they started the sort of poke around and the search of the house, and they came across, or the experienced cop came across, an Xbox. Now at the time, Xboxes had just come out. They were the latest, greatest thing. I think they were like £500 or £600. You know, they were a lot of money. And I think it was one of those scenarios where, you know, they were like the favourite toy for Christmas, or gift for Christmas, so no one could get hold of them. So they were rare as hen's teeth, you know, as well as being worth quite a bit. And the experienced cop said to the young one, "Wow, look at this, you know, I can't believe it, this guy's got an Xbox, you know, these are so rare at the moment, and they're a lot of money, you know, I wonder how he's afforded this, probably with all the cocaine he's dealing." And he jokingly said to the young cop, or at least he thought he was at the time, "Wow, I'd really like one of these. I couldn't afford this, you know, and even if I could, I bet I couldn't find one in the shops anyway because they're all sold out. God, it'd be nice to have one of these, wouldn't it?" And that was kind of how the conversation went, and nothing more was thought of it, and the search continued on. As I say, they seized the cocaine and they found the stolen car, and da-di-da, you know, that all carried on. So they head back to the Nick. They're in the backyard at the police station, and when they go to unload their car, they take out all the evidence, correctly bagged and sealed and signed and all, you know, legally and above board, which was done. And then the experienced cop goes to the boot of the car and takes out a square black, you know, sort of dustbin bag, you know, a bin bag. And the young cop says to him, "What's that? You know, I don't remember seizing anything like that. You know, we've got the coke and we've got the car keys and we've got the cash and all that has been counted and signed off, but we didn't seize anything like that. What have you got in there, you know?" So at this point, the experienced cop opens the bag up, shows the young cop inside, and it's the Xbox. And he says, well, I thought we'd just have this away. I don't think it's fair this guy has this. He doesn't need it, and it's not like he's going to say anything. So I thought I'd just help myself. So I took it. And the young cop was just mortified, just stopped in his tracks and couldn't believe what he's hearing. Now, a lot of the time when you're at police training college, they'll tell you about, bent cops and cops that are hooky, whether that's, assaulting people, stealing stuff, whatever it is. And you find it very tough to stomach, very hard to believe, to be honest with you. And the other thing is they'll tell you about PSD, which is the complaints department, that look at police. And they call various things in various forces, but let's call them PSD for now. This is, the internal police complaints people. There's lots of talk and urban myths about them, sort of setting traps in police stations to catch out cops that aren't honest. And the classic is that if you ever walk into a nick and in a canteen or in a locker room or a report writing room, wherever you are, if there's a coin on the floor or on the table or anywhere you can think of around, and it doesn't matter whether it's a 1p coin, the lowest possible denomination in the UK, or like a pound coin or a 50p or whatever it is, it will not be touched. It will sit there for months and months at a time. And it's a bit of a standing joke because the suggestion is it's a PSD plant and they're testing cops to see if they're dishonest. So they're going to leave, like pound coins around, and anyone who picks it up and thinks, oh, well, no one needs that, I'll just stick that in my pocket. That's it. They're going to swoop down from helicopters, men in black, crashing through the windows on ropes, and take you into custody because you're a bent cop. So everyone's terrified to touch anything, and I say, honestly, I've worked for places for years, where a coin has never moved because everyone jokingly says, well, that's a PSD plant. So, but we take this to the extreme level. The young cop's first thought was that this was some sort of test. This was also, excuse me, this was also some sort of, PSD test, a plant, a test of his probation. This guy only literally had like 6 months in the job, and he was convinced that this was some sort of test. So he didn't say anything initially. He kind of let it go, and he was aware that this cop had taken off the Xbox in a bag and had put it in his locker, in the locker room, and then had done the right thing with the cash and the coke and all the rest of the stuff, and had booked that into evidence as it was and had been signed in, and that was all above board. It was just this Xbox. So the poor cop had a real conundrum. Now, he was honest and he was a good cop, and he turned into a very good cop, but he felt put in such a difficult position because he thought, I don't know what to do about this. I should tell someone, but if it's a test, even amongst my team, and I tell someone, and now that, it was a joke and they wanted to see if I said anything, and, they'll forever think that I'm someone that can't be trusted. And, all this, he was in this real conundrum. He didn't know what to do about it. So he let it go for a little while. I'm talking like, an hour or two. And he said he even went back to the guy's locker and had a look in it to make sure that it was still there. And like he said he kept looking around the locker room or anywhere and basically waiting for his sergeant or his inspector or the cop himself to say, surprise, I'm only mucking about. It was just a little bit of a joke. We wanted to see how you'd react or whatever. And of course, that never happened. So he just didn't know what to do. And in the end, he did the right thing. And it took a lot of guts, in fairness. He went to his inspector about, 5 or 6 in the morning, an hour or two before they were due off shift, and said, sir, can I have a word? This is really awkward. And I might have massively got the wrong end of the stick here, but I have to tell you about something. And he came clean and he basically explained exactly that, to this inspector, what had happened and everything that had happened, basically. And the inspector said, rightly, you've done the right thing. You've come to me and, this isn't right. This isn't a test. It does seem like, he genuinely has taken this Xbox and we need to check on it and check on the story. So this PC was spirited away to another police station, and where a formal statement was taken from him. And then obviously this was the sort of time that I came into the story, when I was then tasked to go and put this crime scene on to seal off the locker room. And eventually both the inspector and I think maybe a detective, like a DI or someone, detective inspector, went in together and formally searched this guy's locker, found the Xbox, recovered it and got it out. And then, as I said, we were allowed, and I knew none of this at this point. We then slowly, one by one, allowed people in to get things, you know, when they're escorted, like we said. So really difficult situation, but ultimately the senior cop who'd stolen the Xbox, and, you know, let's not dress it up, that's what he'd done, was arrested, and his house was searched. And it turns out that when they went back to his house, they found some more cocaine and a load of cash, and it actually looked like he had been seizing cocaine and keeping some for himself, possibly to sell, you know, and he had a lot of unexplained cash. I mean, he was as bent as they come, basically, and had probably been at it for years. You know, he's the classic bad apple that ultimately you are trying to root out, you know, and that no one wants to have in the police because of all the terrible damage they can do, not only to members of the public, but also for the cops around them. You know, they can drag them in and almost drag this young cop in. Now, in fairness, this young cop came back to the team, the same team, and the senior cop who he had, you know, told the inspector about was a well-liked, you know, sort of popular guy. But everyone knew that the young cop had done the right thing, and in no way it reflected badly on him. And he went on, as I say, to be a really good cop that was well respected. I think he's an inspector now. Excuse me. And yeah, so a really, really difficult situation for everyone involved. And like I say, quite an unpleasant and uncomfortable story for me to tell, because there'll be people out there listening for sure go, I knew it, the Met, they're all bent, everything you see on the news is right. But I come back to that point that at this stage there's 35,000 cops in the Met, and, you know, 90% of them are great people doing a really difficult job under difficult circumstances, and 10% for sure, you know, are at it. They're up to no good, they're dishonest, you know, and they're willing to carry out things, whether it's assaults, thefts, whatever. But you cannot afford to say all cops are bent, the whole of the Met is bent. You know, that you just can't say that. That's just not fair to all the good cops in the Met and all the other forces that are trying their best. And obviously I'm a bit biased, but I'm trying to give a sort of a balanced view of this. I think we'll probably call that an end this week. I've got lots more stories, but there was one I was going to put on the end there, but to be honest with you, trying to keep these to around about half an hour, and I just don't think the 3 minutes or so left will do it justice. So we'll save it for next time. Thanks very much for listening. Hope it was interesting. Bit of rambling, that one, but hopefully it gives you a little, you know, a side story there to think about, and a slightly different angle on police and police work. Very uncomfortable time for me, certainly, standing on that locker room. Quite a lonely post to have at that point. Okay, take it easy. Speak again soon. Cheers. Bye.